Hello friends, welcome to the series which we are doing on issues in world history 20th century, and today we will talk about capitalist industrialization. In the earlier lectures on capitalist industrialization, we have talked about the various aspects which are associated with the capitalist industrialization and how it was also closely connected with the issue of industrial revolution in Britain, and how agricultural revolution in Britain also was an important factor in the framework of the industrial revolution. We also talked about the idea was of some of the thinkers, those who have talked about the capitalist industrialization, and thereafter we also talked about the capitalist industrialization in France, where we in a way compared the situation in Britain as well as France, and why the industrial revolution or capitalist development in France could not take place earlier than Britain. And when you talk about how the capitalist entrepreneur or the pre-capitalist social system, when you talk about and how the development of the capitalist entrepreneur took place, and when you talk about the case of France, we talk about the ancient regime, and we also find that there was an estate system in France where there was a stratum in which all the three major benefits, the privilege, power and the prestige, were largely determined at the birth and were also fixed as legal inequalities as well. And we find that the upper stratum of the state, the way the society was functioning at that point of time, and how aristocracy it constituted the dominant estate, which was stratified within itself as well. And we also see that church constituted a separate stratum, but not determined by birth. And when you talk about these estate system, even in the third estate, the stratum of the urban tradesmen and artisans, guild system carefully regulated the distribution of benefits. And we find that how the modern bourgeoisie, they grew out of the third estate, as for instance the developments preceding the French Revolution make it very clear. So we find that the French Revolution, which took place in 1789, and how the estate system was in a way not liked by the people, those who were against it, and how the power, privileges, etc., they were being cornered by the people, those who were at the higher rung of the society. And we find that the people, those who were at the lower rung of the society, how they were being exploited and discriminated. And we see that it was an important aspect that one of the first demands of this new class was the legal equality of all, or at least of those above a certain minimal level of wealth. And when you talk about the new bourgeoisie of these times, we find when they were talking about the legal equality in that sense, and the relation of an individual to the order of privilege should no longer be determined by birth or by royal favor, but rather by his role and success in the production process. And we find that the scholars, those who have worked on the different aspects of the relations which are there in the society, Max Weber was one of them, and he has placed the contrast between the estates and the classes at the core of his theory of social stratification. And Karl Marx made this a key criteria in his analysis of what constituted a class. And when you talk about the class system, we find that in the Marxian theory, class conflict is seen as one of the important constituents of his theories, and how he used the concept of class in the political analysis. And Karl Marx held that a class must have a certain degree of cohesion and a sense of common purpose, as well as a common relationship to the means of production. So in that sense, when we talk about the various classes which are there and how a class functions, and so Karl Marx has identified certain features which are associated with the class. And when he talks about the cohesion, that they must have certain common identity, in that sense that they belong to one group, and they have to have some kind of a purpose which is common in nature, and a common relationship to the means of production as well. And we find that when you talk about the feudal states, they were too internally stratified to possess this kind of attribute. And we see that one very significant change with the capitalist industrialization has been the enormous expansion of the middle strata, because when the new industries came, when the new factories they were being established, we find that people from the rural centers or rural areas, they came to the urban centers. Now they started working in the factories, and many of them, they also got into entrepreneurial activity over a period of time. They were able to make their own fortune. So some kind of a stratification within that particular class could also be seen during that time. And we find that the capitalist accountancy, it called for a secular bureaucracy, an army of the agents and the clerks to keep the accounts, to attend to the correspondence, to furnish the news necessary in order to take the advantage, if possible, before anyone else, of the changed market conditions. So we see that different kinds of jobs, etc., they cropped up, and we find that people, they were being required for these kinds of work, whether they were working as the agents or they were being used as clerks to maintain the accounts, and the various kinds of correspondence which was also happening because of the capitalist industrialization, how the factories or the companies, they are interacting with each other. And so in that way we find that the market conditions at that point of time, they also change. And one of the first visible entry of capitalism perhaps into the medieval town was made by the grammar school, where elements of reading, writing and arithmetic were the main objects of study. And we also see that the control of paper became a mark of new commercial bureaucracy. So in that sense, we in a way realize that how schools, they were also preparing children in that sense for the capitalist activities, where elements of reading, writing and arithmetics, they were being taught to the students, and they were also needed when they got into the various kinds of tasks which were associated with the factory system in terms of maintaining accounts or giving answers to the various correspondence which were happening at that point of time. And we find that how paper, in that sense, the writing on that particular paper became a mark of the new commercial bureaucracy of that particular period. And when you talk about the various institutions, and one of the institutions that marked the turning point in the development of the commercial town was bourse, or the stock market or exchange, which began to serve as a center for large scale impersonal commercial transactions in 13th century. So when you talk about the stock market or the kind of exchange which was there, so not the stock markets of the present times, but we see that this kind of an institution in its rudimentary stage, it made a beginning at that point of time. And we also see that when these kinds of changes, they were happening, then one of the causes of these developments was undoubtedly technological, because technological changes, they were also happening at that point of time. And we see an ever smaller portion of the labor force was required for the actual task of the material production, allowing the diversion or even larger number of workers into administrative activities. So we find that how the labor force which was there in the production process, and some of the labor force was also engaged in the administrative activities of that time. And we find that over a period of time, an expansion of the state bureaucracies because of the kind of work which was available. And one of the risks of the capitalist firm as a new and immensely important form of economic organization has also encouraged the growth of bureaucracy at that point of time. And it means that the separation between the legal ownership of the property and the function of the economic control of the assets it entails. And it has also been suggested that the effective control over the economic resources rather than legal ownership of them is defining criteria for the top capitalist class. So when you see it from that perspective, then we find that the people, those who are controlling the economic resources at that point of time, rather than the legal ownership, was one of the important factors which defined the top capitalist class, because these were the people, those who had control over the economic resources. And this kind of a distinction, whether the legal ownership or the way, the function of the economic control of the assets, it was an important kind of a distinction of this of that time. And the focus was on, in a way, controlling the economic resources rather than the legality which was involved. And we see how Max Weber, in his work Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, and he makes it clear that a capitalist enterprise and the pursuit of gain are not at all same thing. And the people have always wanted to be rich, but that has little to do with capitalism, which he identifies as a regular orientation to achievement of profit through nominally peaceful economic exchange. So in his work Protestant Ethic, as I communicated, that how Max Weber talks about this kind of connection which is there, and how a capitalist enterprise and the pursuit of gain, they are not the same thing, as he tries to communicate. And he says that this kind of a desire of the people to be rich was always there, but it had nothing to do with capitalism, or rather it had little to do with capitalism in those times. And he sees that it was a regular orientation to achievement of profit through the economic exchange, because trade was an important concern. This kind of an exchange was also happening. And he also points out that there were mercantile operations, very successful and of considerable size, in Babylon, Egypt, India, China and medieval Europe. And he says that it is only in Europe since Reformation that capitalist activity has become associated with rational organization of formerly free labor. So Max Weber also talks in this framework, where he talks about the mercantile operations of that time, which were very successful also, and their area of operation was quite huge. They were large in that sense. Many countries of that time, they were engaged in such kind of mercantile operations. And he also talks about Europe and says that since the time of the Reformation, how the capitalist activity became associated with the rational organization of the formerly free labor. And we find that because of this kind of these kinds of activities which were happening at that point of time, there was a new type of and there was a need for a new type of economic agent, the capitalist entrepreneur. And Weber gives one of the insights that has remained widely accepted, is that the capitalist entrepreneur is a very distinctive type of human being, and Weber was fascinated by that. He thought to begin with was a puzzling paradox. So he in a way talks about the capitalist entrepreneur and provides some kind of a distinction to this particular capitalist entrepreneur. And we find that in many cases men, and even in few cases we find women, and they evince the drive towards accumulation of wealth, but at the same time showed a ferocious asceticism, some kind of a singular absence of interest in the worldly pleasures that such wealth could buy. And many entrepreneurs, they actually pursued a lifestyle that was decidedly frugal. So he talks about these kinds of capitalist entrepreneurs and how their area of operation or the kind of functioning which they had, and they had this kind of a drive, they wanted to accumulate the wealth. But he also talks about that how these people, they had some kind of asceticism, where they did not have interest in the worldly pleasures, they did not want to buy everything with that wealth which they wanted to accumulate. And so their lifestyle, if we want to see the standard of living in that sense, was frugal in nature. They were not spendthrift, they were not spending that kind of a money which they were accumulating for themselves. So whether this kind of an idea, where the kind of money which they were earning and the kind of money which they were spending, there was a huge gap in that. So was it an odd kind of a thing? And Weber in that sense, he says that he found an answer in what he called this worldly asceticism of Puritanism, a notion that he expanded by reference to the concept of calling. So, Weber was trying to find answers to this kind of a behavior by the people, those who were earning so much, yet they were not spending that money, that he refers to this as this worldly asceticism. And this kind of asceticism of Puritanism, which he says, and he in a way expands this kind of a reference by referring to the concept of calling as well. And this kind of an idea, it could be seen from the times of Reformation, and when you talk about the kind of background to it, then we find that behind it lies that highest form of moral obligation of the individual was in that sense, and the best way to fulfill his duty to the God is to help his fellow men now in this world. So, people, they were not ready to in a way spend that money on themselves, and how they had this kind of a moral obligation which they felt as well, and this could be seen in the framework of their duties towards the God, and how they can help their fellow men, those who were there in this world. And we see that how scholars and writers like Weber, they back these assertions by pointing out that the accumulation of wealth in the early stages of capitalism and in Calvinist countries in particular was morally sanctioned only if it was combined with a sober industrious career. So, in a way, Weber talks about other countries as well, and he talks about the kind of principles which were associated with the accumulation of wealth, especially in the early stages of capitalism, and even in the Calvinist countries in particular, that how this kind of accumulation was morally sanctioned only if it was combined with a sober industrious career, that the career also had to be like that. And when you talk about Weber, we find that the capitalism was originally sparked by the religious fervor, and without that fervor, the organization of labor that made capitalism so different from what had gone before would not have been possible. And how Weber was familiar with the religions and the economic practices of non-European areas of the world as well, such as India, China, or the Middle East. And this imbued Protestant ethic with an authority which it might otherwise not have had. So, we find that the familiarity of Weber in this regard, that how he was knowledgeable about the religious and the economic practices of non-European areas as well, the countries which he talks about, and in this way he was able to put forward his argument as well. And he talks about China, where he says that, for example, the widespread kinship units, they provided predominant forms of economic cooperation, naturally limiting influence both of the guilds and of individual entrepreneur. And when he talks about India, he says that Hinduism was associated with great wealth and history, but its tenets about afterlife prevented some same sort of energy that built up under Protestantism, and capitalism proper never developed. So, in that sense, he talks about the various civilizations and how the Chinese civilization, for example, he talks about their kinship units and how these kinship units were an important factor in the economic cooperation which members got from each other, and because of which we also find that how the influence of guilds were restricted, and even the individual entrepreneurs, they were also not there, because we find that how kinship units, they were playing an important role in China. And Hinduism, for that matter, we find that it was also associated with great wealth, and but the kind of ideas which were associated with the afterlife, they in a way prevented the same sort of energy that built up under Protestantism. And capitalism proper never developed in India. This is what he tries to communicate. And when he talks about Europe, then he in a way talks about the advantages of inheriting the traditions of the Roman law, which provided a more integrated juridical practice than elsewhere, and it was in the case of the easing transfer of ideas and facilitating the understanding of contexts. So, we find that how Europe had that kind of an advantage where the Roman law, which was in a way giving them this kind of a thrust, and because of which the more integrated juridical practices they could develop or they could be given to them, and also the transfer ideas, it also became possible, and how it also facilitated the understanding of the contracts during that time. And when you talk about Weber, we find the rational restlessness was psychological makeup of Europe, as he talks about, and the opposite of what he found in the main religions of Asia. And the rational acceptance of the social order by Confucianism and its irrational antithesis in Taoism, mystical acceptance of the social order by Hinduism, and the worldly retreat in Buddhism. Weber located rational restlessness especially in Puritanism. So, in that way, how he tries to connect the capitalist ethic in the framework of Protestantism, and we also find that when he talks about the enterprising people, that how these people, those who are enterprising in nature, because they are liberated from the strong communal ties which enable them to seek new opportunities without the constraints of collective traditions, customs and taboos. So, he tries to communicate this kind of an idea also, that these people, those who were the capitalist entrepreneur now, they did not have those kinds of restrictions in terms of the kinship ties or in terms of the collective which was not there. They were comparatively more individualistic in nature. And this kind of a thing would also involve some kind of an ego ideal, some kind of a strong discipline. These kinds of traits Weber called them inner worldly asceticism. So, in that sense, we find that this kind of a discipline which was required for them in that sense, or ego ideal which was required for them. So, this made them inner worldly asceticism. And when you talk about such kind of individuals, how they were in a way connected to the affairs of this world, they were pragmatic in nature, and they were geared to action as against the more contemplative or the sensitive values. So, they had this kind of an approach where we find that they were more practical in nature, and he in a way also self denying in that sense, prepared for the delayed gratification as against someone who immediately spends all he makes. So, we find that these people believed in the delayed gratification, and how these people whatever was being earned by them, they were not spending it all at one go, and this kind of asceticism was also there, rather than the idea of being acquisitive in that sense, and this in a way distinguishes the capitalist entrepreneur. And there were others like Schumpeter, who stressed the central role of the capitalist entrepreneur rather than the stock of capital as incarnation of the technical progress. And in his work Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy, he sought to change the thinking about the economics no less than John Maynard Keynes had done earlier. So, we find that other thinkers, they also had their own ideas, as Weber has talked about, and we find that Schumpeter was one of them who was opposed to both Marx and Keynes, and he was talking about the capitalist system, that how the system was essentially static in nature, and for the employers and the employees as well as for the customers, the system settles down with no profit in it, and there is no wealth for the investment as well. And how the workers, they were only receiving for their own labor, which was based on the cost of producing and selling goods, and profit by implication can only come from innovation, which for a limited time cuts the cost of production. And we find that how it allows a surplus to be used for further investment as well. So, we see that how Schumpeter tries to approach this issue, that when you talk about profit, then it could only come through the innovation, and we also have that when you are trying to innovate, that then you have to bring about changes, then you have to use the surplus, you have to use it for further investments. So, we find two things which were following from this idea was the capitalists themselves are not motivating force of capitalism, but instead entrepreneurs who invent new techniques or machinery by the means of which goods are produced more cheaply. And Schumpeter did not think that the entrepreneurship could be taught or inherited. So, we find that he sees them in the framework that entrepreneurship could not be inherited, it was there intrinsic in an individual, and he believed that it was a bourgeois activity. And by this he meant that in any urban environment people would have ideas for innovation, but who had those ideas when and where they are, and what they did with them was very unpredictable kind of a thing. And so in his ideas in that sense, how the bourgeois people, they acted not out of any theory or philosophy, but for pragmatic self interest, and this flatly contradicted Marx's analysis. And another element of Schumpeter's outlook was that profit as generated by entrepreneur was temporary in nature, and whatever innovation which was being introduced would be followed by others in that sector of industry or commerce, and a new stability would eventually be achieved. And this meant that for Schumpeter, capitalism was inevitably characterized by cycles of boom and in a way stagnation. So, in this particular topic, we talked about the various kinds of ideas of various thinkers and also the historical developments. So, with this I would like to end the lecture. Thank you very much.